Part 2 picks up with an in-depth look at the A4 Skyhawk and Woodward's missile trap.
So we now have the A4 Skyhawk, which is with Latin and hop. Right, you're going to tell us all about it. And by the way, for anyone who's wondering, the A4 Skyhawk, we talked about it a little bit earlier. One of them went into a controlled dismount into a mountain, and the other one into the sea, which is an Argentinian part of the Argentinian Air Force. Hop, Latin.
Well, the A4 Skyhawk was procured by the Argentine Air Force beginning around the mid-1960s. And it's a really, I'll do this really fast, give you a quick overview because it does help us to understand what kind of an Air Force they were by 1982. They were the first country in South America to fly jets, Gloucester Meteors, as it were, as it was, in 1947. Think about that. But by the 1960s, when they needed to replace those, the Argentine economy was already in decline. And so they went with the used option of not upgraded, but of some minor upgrades in navigation, but mostly overhauled former U.S. Navy A4s. These were first generation A4s, A4Bs, and in two batches, mid 60s and late 60s into around 1970. 50 in total of that variant. By the time they were assigned to the Grupo Cinco de Caza, the 5th fighter group based at Villareynolds. And by 1982, they were probably down to about 25 operational aircraft. I'll explain in a moment what the reasons behind that lowered level of operational readiness. Argentine Air Force is a very professional force, very motivated, well led. I think it's always important to mention, because it does sometimes, I do sometimes see this in social media, that although the timing of this operation of Rosario to take the islands was politically driven, the claim of the islands is a well-held thing among Argentines at all levels. And the men who were assigned to fly missions over the South Atlantic there was no lack of dedication to the cause. And I think that's always important to emphasize. And that is borne out in when you look at their operations. But there were a couple of factors that had affected operational readiness by 1982. Economic, which had led to, the fact that they had to buy an older aircraft to replace their first generation jets, but also that affected training, flight hours, and maintenance, acquisition of parts. Another factor that gets often lost in Western sources and sources outside of Argentina was that 1976, the year that of the military coup, the beginning of the dictatorship in Argentina, was also the year that the Carter administration came to power in the U.S., which had a strong emphasis on human rights. This meant that by 1982, they were already suffering from parts shortages as a result of embargoes on the part of the U.S. So that really affected the type being an American aircraft. So approximately 25 operational. It was a rugged, dependable single-engine attack aircraft that had seen its various variants, had seen combat already in Vietnam, in the Middle East. The Argentine pilots knew it well, as they would show very soon. They knew how to fly it very well, but there was a doctrinal limit that was to be a very big factor by the 25th of May. And that was it was actually a legal restriction on the Air Force being trained for, indeed even acquiring the equipment for overwater anti-ship operations. That was strictly the area for the Navy, naval aviation, to be involved in. So these men had practiced over land operations against the most likely enemy, which was Chile, with whom they had almost reached a state of war in 1978, primarily delivering weapons like it was the favorite weapon, the 1,000-pound British bomb, the bombola, as they called it, and for medium level for the most part. Suddenly, and another factor to remember, 2nd of April 1982, as with most of the Argentine armed forces, the men of the 5th Fighter Group learned of the invasion on that morning. And so now they looked at a very compressed period of through the rest of April, where they had to wrap their heads around attacks on naval vessels, something they had simply never done before. They had consultations with men of the naval aviation. They had some experience. The Navy had some experience because they had the 2 Type 42s. I'm sure that could be discussed a little further, but there were some differences, as I understand, but they had a basic understanding of how the Type 42 worked. And again, crash course, and they were told by the naval aviation that of 4 aircraft in a flight approaching these ships, on average, 3 would be shot down. So they knew very well what they were getting into. They knew very well that this was for all the deficiencies and issues that some of you have raised with the Royal Navy. From the Argentine point of view, they were up against a NATO-trained force, a force centuries of combat experience, and with kit that was way in advance of anything they had. A relatively simple light attack aircraft, no chaff, no ECM. They were down to low-level flying as a primary source of defense or survivability. And also some of the flying tactics on the runs in, which we can discuss later, was something that they had developed. And again, with their Navy colleagues, in particular, hopefully against the Type 42s, they hoped would be successful. And to an extent, it might have been. I think that's all. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, well, I'm just going to jump in and sort of put some icing on that cake. It's important that Latin really pointed this out. It was what the A4s were lacking that was kind of a difference maker. And the things that they were lacking was, and I'll break them down real quickly. 1, training. 2, weapon systems. 3 would be the lack of defensive systems, and 4, I would call it not leadership at the group and squadron level, but leadership at the level above that. So real quickly, they were lacking any kind of a radar warning system. So if there was a missile launched upon them, if they hadn't visually spotted that missile, they were unaware that it was in the air. And that is a huge disadvantage. These A4Bs, when they were pulled off the line and sold, they had been equipped with RWR in Vietnam, and that was not made available to the Argentinians. They also lacked onboard integral navigation systems that were reliable. Some of them had Omega systems, but those systems have a lot of drift, and they require you to be pretty close in to the Omega stations that are broadcasting them to get an accurate fix. And Omega just wasn't a system that was great for low-level navigation far offshore. So, and when it worked, and it was, having used that earlier in my career, Omega systems, they're pretty skittish. We talked about lacking the radar, and they didn't have a wide array of ordnance available to them that was truly designed for anti-shipping missions. Additionally, going to the training, they got to talk to the naval Skyhawk drivers as part of the Argentinian Navy, but they didn't really get to practice the run-ins, and they're very adept at nap of the earth terrain masking approaches, but they weren't used to targets that are moving. Ships are moving when you attack them. They weren't used to a target that's moving and shooting back at you. And these are adjustments tactically. And they made these adjustments, but there were certain assumptions that they had, especially relative to the fusing of their bombs, which will be discussed when we talk about Coventry's day on the 25th, that were lessons that were learned very much the hard way. That's kind of the main points on the A4. The other point that needs to be emphasized is the A4 in a full combat loadout has a range that doesn't allow it to spend really any time in the area of operations. They were operating right at the edge of their unrefueled combat radius, and they really, to get back home or to get into the mission, they needed to be refueled at least on the way in or on the way out, so of attacking a target in the Falklands. and this is a huge issue too, that the Argentinian Air Force, because of their doctrines, that was focused on Chile, didn't fully appreciate how they needed more air refueling capability than they actually had. And by the time the war started, it was far too late to acquire anymore.
Can I ask a question?
Fire away.
Where did they learn anti-ship strike? I mean, this isn't. I mean, taking two pairs of A4s against a 42 is not, that's not low level basic day one airmanship. They understood it. They understood the limitations, which we know because they had two 42s. But were Argentine Air Force pilots trained abroad, or was this purely
the naval
house? They did their own training scenarios, used Santissima Trinidad and her sister, and basically came up with this doctrine themselves. Because if so, I think that makes it even more impressive.
Actually, Dom, as I understand it, the majority of the training that they did, and again, it was very compressed in the month of April, was because I'm not sure that they actually did any runs on Type 42s. If they did it, they weren't many. Primarily, they were training. Like you said, I think this is kind of an impressive thing to consider. The bulk of their anti-ship training was against a beached, rusted-out old hulk in southern Argentina that had been wrecked many decades before. That was it. That was their target. That's what they were working on. And they had not had any previous anti-ship experience.
And the what little training that they were able to squeeze out of that very brief period of time, that was a trickle down from the Argentinian naval Skyhawk pilots had trained in the United States, gone through the USN training program, starting in primary and then going through advanced training in the what would have been the TA4Js. So there would have been doctrinal transfer of the knowledge. That being said, the A4 was not really a ship attack. It was a ground attack aircraft for the USN and the USMC. So this was a fairly homegrown effort, and is truly impressive. And they learned by doing. And the crews that were attacking Coventry, the three different engagements they had on the day of the 25th, all of those pilots, if you go back into the war history, they had been to the Falklands many times in the preceding really week. All these guys had multiple combat sorties under their belt. So that's the A4 in a nutshell. Did we leave anything out there, Latin?
I would just touch briefly on, and we can talk more detail later, but the ordnance and bombs in particular, because that was the primary weapon here, were free fall unguided bombs. And although the British, believe it was the Mark 17, the one the Argentinians called the Bombola, was their primary weapon for this group pre-1982, they were in the process of acquiring new weapons, which and this is very relevant to the engagement with Coventry, which would end up being more effective for a number of reasons. The size of the size of the bomb being smaller, less mass, more likely to find itself to be stopped inside the ship by the structure of the ship, where the Mark 17 being 1,000-pounder, being such a large weapon, often would just go right through them. And they had already seen that in some of the engagements that Hop had mentioned. So the BRP 250, this was a Spanish series of bombs that looked very much aerodynamically like an American Mark 82, in parachute retarded and in slick version, were acquired, and these would play an important role on the 25th.
Keith, have you any observations about what was happening in the ops room when this stuff was flying?
Not really. I mean, we were in there up until the 25th. We were just in there tracking the aircraft in and out and trying to shoot them down. That's about it.
Question for you, because I think this is an important thing leading up to the 25th, but also leading up to the conflict generally. What had you personally, if anything, heard or understood about the Air Force that you would be up against, the capabilities of the Argentine Air Force?
In all, we had Jane's fighting ships and Jane's all-world aircraft. There were photocopies of the Argentine order of battle hung up around the ship, so that anyone could come by and have a look and see what we're up against. Admiral Woodward, on the way south, he came on board all the ships, and he gathered the officer and crew off watch in the dining hall, the chow hall, and he was talking about how he sees things are going to go. We're going to be doing A, B, and C. Oh, and by the way, some of you guys will not be going home. There was dead silence. That is not how you instill good morale in your men. I don't know what the other guys thought about that, but I didn't like him from that moment on. And his book, 100 Days, reflects his attitude to what he thought was the right way. It was his way or the highway. So we knew that we're up against Mirage, Dagger, which is another name for a Mirage, A4s, Airmachis, Learjets. We knew they had maybe one tanker, air tanker, and a couple of old Neptunes for MPA, Maritime Patrol. And obviously we knew that they had two Type 42s. Strangely enough, the previous year, we'd been berthed aboard of one in Portsmouth Harbour. That's about it, I think. We knew what we were up against. We didn't know how good their pilots were. We didn't know that they would be as brave as they were, because they were. I mean, when you're flying 40 feet above 10-foot waves, that takes big balls. I think that's it.
I think that's a thing in the Navy. I don't know about other NATO forces, but there seems to be a perverse kind of. And Kate, did you have your usual ops department mass meeting before Desert Storm?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, I mean ours was absolutely horrific. It was the AWO who it was kind of he listed off the threats. He did anti-ship missiles. He said the Iraqi Air Force, they're probably going to make an appearance. It's going to be a very congested battle space up north. They've got AM-39, but the main thing is the chemical weapon threat. There will be chemical, biological weapons used. And gentlemen, you need to kind of reconcile yourselves with the fact that not all of you will be going home, particularly if you're upper deck weapons crews. We've facilitated the arrival of people in the dining hall to sort out wills. I strongly recommend that those of you who don't have a will already make one up. Right? Fucking great, right? Now, yeah, right, true. You don't need to tell the boys that. The end result was number one laundryman fucked off half an hour later once he got the word, and we never saw him again. So there was only number two Chinese laundryman on board till we got to Gibraltar, and two lads went on the trot. So I'm kind of, I get, and I'm a fan of Woodward. I am. I think it's easy to kind of have a crack at him in hindsight. And certainly, I've never had a position of responsibility in the Navy, so it wouldn't be for me to kind of criticize his command style and whatever. And ultimately, he got the job done. But if that's true, I think it's beholden to a senior officer to instill a sense of purpose and optimism. I think there's a time and a place for reality. And I think the boys sat listening to that brief would have known already. You know, you list the threats, and what you say is, look, fellas, these aren't slack. These people know their business. But you're the best in the world. And you will fight through, and you will win. So, eyes front, concentrate on the mission. We'll get this job done. We'll get home. I don't think there's any need for senior officers, and I think that's the thing with officers across the board, to kind of take a little, not subconsciously perverse urge or need to say, some of you will not go home. So I fucking know that, mate. You know.
Well,
yeah,
I'm with you, Dom. I see no benefit to stating something that's morbidly obvious, but I do see plenty of downsides to doing that. And I mean, don't tell them it's all rainbows and lollipops, which you don't need to, because then they're going to shut you out from then on. But and I don't want to go down. We're going to do that leadership pod someday, but this is zero benefit, but to the leadership and style, and it's not motivating. It's demotivating, and people are well aware by the time they've been in the service for a pretty short time of their mortality. So why do it? And I imagine everybody pretty much agrees. There's no upside for those
I was
kinds of
shaking
statements.
my head during that. It's like saying the guy's about to go and clear a minefield. You're dependent on them clearing that minefield. Yeah, you guys. Half of you aren't going to make it, but we need you to go quickly.
Yeah, just shut up. I mean, use your inside voice. Everybody knows that. It's silly. Shall we talk about the attacks against Glasgow and Brilliant?
Please do. Please do.
Okay. So, and you naval guys you ship guys set me straight when I get this wrong. So, the reason we're going to talk about Glasgow and Brilliant is because that's the first, 42-22 combo that I'm aware of. And it has a lot of ramifications for Coventry. And I know Keith knows more about those ramifications than anyone else, but they were operating these two to the southeast of Stanley, outside of the Argentinian stated minefield, doing some doing shore bombardment, and they were testing out, in real world environment, 42-22. Glasgow was the 42, and it was Brilliant was the 22, I think. So, and they had some pretty good success, but on the morning of 12 May, there was Glasgow and Brilliant were attacked twice. On the first attack, which came pretty early in the day, was a flight called the Torno flight, I believe, and Brilliant shot down during this attack 3 out of the 3 attacking Skyhawks. Two were shot down by Seawolf, and 1 was shot down or crashed, I believe, doing missile avoidance maneuvers. And if I get that wrong, set me straight now. It actually gave Woodward and upper leadership a fair amount of confidence about the 42-22 combo. What's different from what I can see, and I want Keith, keep track of, don't let me run off into the weeds here, that they were operating far enough south of the land, and the attack was coming basically from out to sea, that they didn't have all the limitations that the Coventry had operating closer to Pebble Island. So that may have given them given leadership a false sense of confidence. I painfully aware that Hartdyke knew that they needed to stay away from the land because of the Type 42's radar limitations. But this was important because it sort of was a proof of concept. Later that morning, not too much later, maybe 5 minutes, 10 at the most, there was a second wave that attacked the Brilliant and the Glasgow. And that was 4 Skyhawks operating. These guys are operating way out at the end of their range. And they ended up, everybody missed except everybody missed their targets. They had 3 aircraft drop bombs. 2 totally missed, but a Lieutenant Gavazzi, who had opted to use the Mark 17 1,000-pounder, was able to hit Glasgow. But, as is often the case, you'll hear during discussions of the Falkland Air War, the bomb went straight through and didn't detonate, which is an early indication of the fusing issues that the Argentinians were experiencing. And to those who don't know, a bomb is up underneath an airplane. The airplane releases the bomb. There's this long wire, maybe 3 feet long, it's literally just a copper wire that is holding this little propeller in the nose of any bomb of this era. Has a little propeller in it. That propeller spins however number of times, say 50 or 100 or whatever. The bomb becomes active, but it's kept from spinning by this wire until it's separated, say, by about 3 feet or so from the aircraft. If you don't get enough propeller spins before your bomb hits the ground, or in this case, the ship, it's just a big piece of metal. It's not it's 1,000 pounds of kinetic energy, but it's not going to explode. And the reason that propeller didn't unwind enough is because you delivered it at too low an altitude, and it didn't have time to fully spin that propeller the number of times it needed to. So the solution is you either change the number of revolutions, which I think these are fixed. I'm no armorer, but I think these are fixed numbers, or you can mechanically manipulate them. We'll get back to that on the attack on Coventry, or if you deliver at a higher prescribed altitude. And all of these altitudes are known. It is known. There are books that you get that say if you're delivering this weapon at this airspeed, you need to be at this altitude is your minimum altitude for delivery for the bomb to arm. And in talking to reading reports from the Navy A4 pilots flying for the Argentinians, they knew these numbers obviously like the back of their hand, and they would effectively deliver their bombs from an altitude that would allow them to be armed. But at this point, the Argentinians weren't fully aware tactically of the altitude they needed to be at for their bombs to explode. And a 1,000-pound bomb, if it goes off in a Type 42, it's done. It's at best it's combat ineffective. So that's a quick and dirty on the reasons I think that early attack is important. From the British standpoint, it showed them some of the tactics they were going to be dealing with. It showed them.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Fire away.
Tim, was Glasgow broadside on when she was attacked?
Yes. There's that picture, isn't there, of the A4 closing her. She was broadside on. And
right, that's pertinent because of the way Coventry manoeuvred during the final attack and CTG's guidance about remaining broadside on to keep weapon arcs open, and that if you did low-level bombing, your chances of getting an accurate hit were much reduced if a target was broadside on. Yet, Glasgow was hit.
Well, they were.
It was a fusing problem. He managed to put 1,000-pounder in her, and the round went out the other side. There was a small fire that was extinguished by the fuel in the diesel tank, but that might be really important for the next bit, because CTG's guidance was if it's a choice between manoeuvring the ship to present a fine bow aspect on, which is what Coventry did twice, and going broadside on and keeping your weapon arcs open, go for the latter. Stay broadside on, because that minimises the chance of you getting walloped. And yet it didn't actually work with Glasgow.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much of an oblique, if he attacked at a 45-degree angle, he does have a little bit more of a target. Did it go straight through, or did it sort of pierce at an angle? These are unimportant. The Lieutenant Gavazzi, he just did a good job delivering it, and maybe he did. He just did it correctly. But they're right; it is much harder. What a Type 42 is maybe 50 feet wide. Is it even that wide? Is it? That's a lot less of a target available to you than the several hundred feet long if you're able to attack it, say from bow to stern or stern to bow. And in a perfect world, we wanted to attack from the stern, because it was much easier to attack up the wake for a destroyer type thing, and see what the turn is, see what the state of the how much, how big the wake is, how fast it's going. You can pick up a turn much sooner. And also, a lot of times modern destroyers, they have a flight deck on the back that's not quite as bristled with armament as the bow is, especially in 1982. But with the lessons learned from that, there was plenty of missiles and close-in weapon systems to deal with later. But in a perfect world, you wanted to attack not across but longitudinally, because you had a better chance of not messing up and missing it entirely.
But this might be an ideal opportunity to just do a quick tangent, Tim, about manoeuvring the ship under FBA.
There's just one thing I'm going to say about that picture, and it's of relevance later. In that picture of the A4 about to attack Glasgow, the picture's taken from Brilliant's flight deck, and Glasgow is off of Brilliant's port quarter. So Brilliant was ahead of Glasgow and up threat.
Shit, yeah. Yeah, of course, Keith.
Which is where she should have been. And it's where Broadsword should have been on May 25th.
Yeah. Yeah, that didn't even... All right, we need to put a pin in that. Just a quick tangent. So, all right, so in World War II, there was a discussion between the Royal Navy and the US Navy. The Royal Navy favoured open bridges. And what the Royal Navy said is, particularly for destroyers and cruisers, if I'm under air attack as a captain, I need to be on the bridge, and I need as close to 360 vision as I can get. And the reason for that is I retain something called spatial awareness, which Hop and Land will be very aware of. The knowledge of their surroundings, the knowledge of the developing situation, your own position, the position of the enemy, and the ability to kind of formulate that in your head and respond to it. Now, the US Navy was very different. What the US Navy said was, well, yeah, that's great, but if you're on an open bridge, weather affects watchkeepers' exhaustion. It affects their ability to do their job properly, and therefore there's a trade-off between having 360 vision and being tired and exhausted. Do you imagine like a corvette in the North Atlantic in 1942, where it's freezing cold and you're constantly being whacked by gophers, by waves, etc. So there was this discussion, and the Royal Navy really stuck with open bridges until nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare came along. And I think it's fair to say in 1982, and we'll allude to this in a little bit, ops rooms are great for captains if you're fighting a long-range battle. But if you're fighting a ship under fighter-bomber attack, I think there's still a lot to be said for that ability to stand on the bridge and see what's going on around you, and be able to look astern and see what your consort ship is doing, and be able to kind of form that picture in your head, rather than be down 2 decks and looking at a radar screen. And I think that's going to be really pertinent to the conversation about 25th of May. My gut feeling is, at some stage, there may have been a loss of spatial awareness. And that's really easily done if you're in a Navy that's used to fighting that long-range battle, 40, 50 miles, and suddenly you're presented by fast jets coming at you off the coast at 10 miles. You know, that ability to stand up there and look left, look right, look astern, see what your consort's doing, look at the aircraft departing to the west, look at the aircraft approaching from the east, and then kind of make a decision based on your visual observations, as opposed to trying to do it on a radar screen. And Keith, we had a discussion about this. The captain's display on a 42 back in 82, it was something called a JUD, wasn't it? It wasn't a
Yes, it
proper radar.
Correct. It was a raw radar picture.
Yeah, so you know, the captain of HMS Coventry was using a what we call a raw radar display, which is just blips on it with no computer input onto it at all. Whereas 3 feet away, his surface picture supervisor, using ADORs, would have had a picture with track labels on it and all the Gucci stuff, and been able to call up information on his tote, well, back then on the SPR's tote. So, you know, I think if you put a pin in this and then think about what we talk about 25th, I think there's a valid discussion here for fighting the ship from the bridge. And Tim, you said Jeremy Larkin, he fought fearless from the bridge in San Carlos.
Yeah, that's right. And Alan West on Ardent as well.
Dom, can I throw in a quick thought about bomb aiming, because there's an important factor on the Argentine side that's often not discussed. Can I just throw that in quickly?
No, you were asking me if you can, and I'm saying yes.
Right.
Don't ask me, ask David, otherwise he gets really upset.
David, here goes. It's an important one. And this is very relevant to the 25th of May raid. One of the factors, very simple thing that led to a serious problem in bomb aiming for the Argentine pilots, the A4 variant that the Air Force received, the A4B or P as it was officially known, was denavalized to an extent. One of the things that they had removed was the windshield wiper from the windscreen. And this turned out to be a big problem in operations over the South Atlantic, because the salt spray would build up. And they were finding this particularly in the first 2 weeks of May. They were becoming completely blind. They couldn't see. In a lot of these cases, they were delivering the weapons with the bombs were being delivered just eyeball. That became even harder with this condition. Some of the ground crews, or one person in particular, was able to come up with a chemical solution that helped quite a bit. And in the case of Pablo Caravaggio, who flew on the 25th, his overly anxious ground crewman had wiped his windscreen beautifully clean that morning, and in doing so had removed this chemical agent. So Pablo Caravaggio, the first A4 in on the Coventry that day, was essentially blind, looking out of the side of his aircraft and aiming that 1,000-pound bombola with his eye.
Well, I didn't know that. I mean, having had windscreens, frost, it's like a frost over effect. The salt incrustation, it just becomes a white mass. Think of your car when you go out in the morning after a heavy frost and you can't see out. It's essentially the same. Sure, light penetrates, but nothing else. And that can make it pretty difficult when you get back. I remember we used to occasionally look around just for a cloud to fly through to try and get some moisture on the windshield and get it off there in P3s. So it's a big deal.
I didn't know salt on the windows of a blimp was a problem.
Well, I mean, we'd have to stop pedaling and then get out with a squeegee.
You have to get your foot pump out and whack some hydrogen in.
Yes, but then we'd smear our mustache wax on there, and Baleen comb it off and put some whale oil on there, and it'd be fine.
Dom, Tim, the Woodward's missile trap idea. Do you want to explain it?
It's not really explainable, is it? No. So, on the 21st, we did the San Carlos podcast, didn't we? It was the most brutal fighting of the war. Ardent was sunk, and there were 5 other ships damaged. But on the other side, the Argentines lost 17 aircraft, which included 3 helicopters. So, from the British side, it was thought we need to do something to try and break up the air attacks before they get to the Sound, and if not, at least provide some sort of heads up for the ships in the Sound that a raid's going to be with them in the next few minutes, because pretty much as we were discussing in San Carlos, the ships in the Sound and in San Carlos, the first they would know of a raid coming is when you've got some jets bearing down on you from just a couple of miles away. So it was really, the plan was twofold: to try and interdict some of the raids, and via a local anti-air warfare communications net on UHF, to give the ships in San Carlos at least a few minutes heads up, if we could, that there was a raid coming in. It had to be done on UHF because there was quite a bit of concern raised that there was too much going on HF, which the Argentines could not only DF, but they could pick it up and hear what we were doing. And that has implications on the 25th, where the ships have got to stay within UHF range of San Carlos. And so that's where the plan was. We've had, as Hop said before, we've had this bit of success with the 22-42 combo. So let's put a 22-42 combo off the north coast of West Falkland to try and break up the raids and give some better warning. Dom?
Yeah, I mean, the idea was actually fairly simple in concept. So, but it was also a lash up in specific doctrine. So, as Tim said, you need to protect the AOA, the amphibious operating area, and raids were coming in and they were playing havoc with the shipping. Everything depended on the AOA, right? That the beachhead was primary concern. So we needed to interdict Argentine strike, secondary resupply flights into Port Stanley. How do you do that? You combine a warship with medium-range surface-to-air missile and long-range radar, Coventry, with a ship with point defense and a good pulse Doppler radar, which was broadsword. The added advantages, of course, were that Coventry had a gun on the front. So if there were opportunities to re-task to do naval gunfire support and throw some rounds at Argentine positions ashore, this 2-ship, what we call a SAG, a surface action group, had that capability within them. And of course, Type 42s had a dedicated fighter controller. Now, I don't think, I've researched, I don't think Type 22s had that provision, but I might be wrong on that. but certainly Type 42s would have a dedicated FC fighter controller on duty in the ops room in a defence watch. The problem with it was it was done on the fly. There was no real conceptual guidance on this contained within fighting instructions. So what do you need? Well, you need good communications with the amphibious operating area, right? Because you're a 2-ship group and your job is to stop raids getting through to the beachhead. So you need to be able to talk to the beachhead in the clear, and definitely not have to relay through a third party, which, as we'll see, was the case on today. It also absolutely relies on understanding the difficulties of moving 2 ships together to counter fighter-bomber attack, right? And again, this wasn't laid down in anything in the ATPs, which are they're like the Bible of naval operating instructions, because it was never really envisaged that we would have to do the Type 42, Type 22 combination. And what you're faced with is a conundrum. Maneuver to take into account your weapon arcs, so the best course and speed for your weapon systems to engage an incoming threat, or maneuver to put your bow or your stern on to an approaching fighter bomber attack and present that fine aspect that makes final aim for the pilot very difficult. And as I said, there wasn't really anything in there. CTG from the flagship was of the opinion that broadside on would be best. It's better to be able to shoot than to try and avoid a bombing run. And actually, as Hop said, if you're talking about 50-foot beam, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that out of 3 bombs, 2 might land short and 1 might go over. As we saw with Glasgow, actually, the bomb aiming was actually spot on. It was the fusing that was the problem. So you need to be able to maneuver in company. Changes in course and speed and stationing need to be communicated very clearly. So that's going to be by flag, right? And by short-range tactical radio. And both ships need to understand both the threat axis and how they're going to maneuver as a pair to counter each threat. Now, it sounds fairly simple, and it's not. It's genuinely, even with 2 ships. Imagine doing it with a carrier and 5 or 6 escorts. It's actually really, really difficult. Now, if you put the problems together, what had happened is Coventry and Broadside had discussed it and decided that the idea was that Coventry would be guide and Broadsword would follow her in manoeuvring. So Tim, do you want to quickly explain that?
So it's basically Coventry's the boss, and what Captain Canning in Broadsword said to Captain Hartdyke was basically, you manoeuvre as required for your weapon arcs for Sea Dart, and I won't get in your way, but don't come up in speed if I'm trying to get past. So the actual signal for in which the formation is promulgated, it says that Coventry's the guide. We call that Zulu Zulu. And for Broadsword to take station, I think it's so long since I've read signals about that, but I think it's saying basically within half a mile all round. So as long as the signal says, so as long as Broadsword is within half a mile of Coventry, with Coventry on any bearing from north to 359 degrees, broadswords in station. But as we mentioned before, tactically, really you want broadsword in front and up fret. But the signal doesn't actually say that.
So broadsword had seniority. It looks like it was a very egalitarian sort of conversation. It is clear that broadsword and Coventry were they were having a conversation and they were trying to work out best tactics, and mutually they decided the broadsword should follow between 5 and 7 cables astern, but broadsword should remain up fret. And as Keith said, that doesn't make any sense because there were numerous problems with this formation. So first of all, HMS Broadsword's 967 radar was subject to issues if she went over a certain speed. Anything over 22 knots, and there would be vibration on the mainmast, and that could affect the radar. So if you think about it, if you've got a lead unit that is following a course and speed, and then you've got an astern unit that has to maneuver to keep herself up fret closer to the air raid, she's going to have to move faster. Therefore, she's going to need more engine power. Therefore, the chances of her needing more revs and therefore having issues with vibration in the radar are going to be greater. So hindsight is a wonderful thing, right? And look, I wasn't an officer watch, I was just an RP. But to me, it makes sense that broadsword should have been guide, and Coventry, that wasn't constrained by manoeuvring restrictions, probably should have manoeuvred up and down fret. There are also concerns about Coventry's Olympus gas turbines that would produce a lot of smoke at low speed as they ramped up. I'm not sure about that. Fine instructions said that you should always manoeuvre so that you were going upwind, so funnel smoke would be blown aft. However, funnel smoke over the bow would affect the gun direction platform and the missile gun director visuals. So you know, there's kind of pros and cons to that. The other issues were broadsword hadn't really practiced goalkeeping, what we call goalkeeping, which is sticking yourself between the HVU, the high value unit, and the fret. That hadn't really been practiced. As we say, Type 64 combination hadn't been practiced on the transit down south. And there was that kind of, because it wasn't laid down in the ATP, there was that conundrum. Do you maneuver to avoid FBA and present minimum aspect, which Hop and Latin will talk about, or do you maneuver to keep weapons arcs open, and that may present a side-on aspect to the attacking aircraft? Now, in your head, you'll think, well, you know, bigger the aspect, the more I've got to attack. But 50-foot beam, you're going to have to be really, really good to stick a bomb in the middle of the target. But, again, Glasgow, they did it. So, if you look at Admiralty guidance, and this is astonishing because this is the Royal Navy, you know, we did the evacuation of Dunkirk. We did the evacuation of Crete. We wrote the fighting manual on low-level air attack. But the firing manual, I think it's Charlie 133189, it wasn't really contained in it, and it wasn't in, as I say, ATP 31. So, you know, the two COs, they really had to do this on the fly and come up with some ideas. Other issues were, and I don't know if you knew, Tim, but 1006 radar was switched off during 25th of May.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so 1006 was switched off because it was interfering with UAA1, the electronic support measures and things. So if the captains were navigating, and particularly Captain Hart Dyke, if he was navigating by radar, he was doing it by 992. Now, what did we say earlier about 992? Absolutely shocking MTI. And if you selected MTI, it would habitually remove surface tracks off the plot. Now, if he had a JUD display, he was just looking at a raw radar. But this feeds into my main concern about this, that there was a spatial awareness problem. That he was sat in the upstream looking at a JUD. He only had 992 radar to go by. My suspicion is there was a loss temporarily, just for a few seconds, of what was going on with the outbound and the inbound raid. And then finally, Link 10 didn't work on the day, on the 25th, despite real promise. Broadsword detecting air contacts and using Link 10 and then trying to indicate to Coventry, it didn't really work. And that's why post-war, 1983-84, there was a software update to try and address that. So I think overall, if you look at the Type 64 combination, theoretically, it absolutely made sense. But I think there was a lack of awareness in CTG, in the flagship, of the real limitations of 992 radar, and the fact that the two captains would have to come up with tactics on the fly, and there was no ATP, nothing really formally laid down to say how to counter fighter bomber attack. And that's astonishing. Again, I go back to, we were learning this at 1940 during the evacuation of Dunkirk. We learned this through the Mediterranean campaign. We learned this through the evacuation of Crete. The importance of being able to maneuver multiple units together to maximize weapon systems and face threats from multiple axes. And yet we forgot it. But I don't know. I suppose it's entirely in keeping with our Sheffield episode where we highlighted the mistakes that were made there. But it was a good concept. I absolutely see why Woodward put it together. But Tim, Woodward versus Hart Dyke.
So, Keith, I'm sure, back us up. What David Hart Dyke told Admiral Woodward he wanted to do was to fight his ship on its own terms. So he wanted to go west of West Falkland and try and get at the Argentine aircraft before they'd descended to low level, so that he could use his Sea Dart system in exactly the way it was designed to be used at range against targets at medium to high level.
Yep.
And the Admiral said no, and he did, I'll give him, he does give some justification in that if it went wrong, you would be too far away for anybody to come and rescue you, kind of thing. But again, Woodward's come up with this plan, and it's my way or the highway. The plan that David Hart Dyke also come up with that I've always really liked, and I listened to Sam McFarlane's interviews that he's done for the Imperial War Museum, and he was a fan of this idea as well, and that was a proper old school sort of like pirate hit and run thing amongst the islands of West Falklands. To sit somewhere, shoot at one raid, and then scoot off, to a different position and try and get the next raid and keep moving around. And I've always thought that would have been a brilliant idea, completely out of the box thinking. he would have kept the ship close to land, but the threat axis would be away from land. So you wouldn't have this problem of aircraft coming at you off the land. So I think that had a lot of potential, as well as sort of from the side of, sort of you cheeky rascal kind of thing, hit and run tactics.
Yeah.
But again, he wasn't allowed to do it.
And I think if I can just jump in here, Tim, if you're looking at some of the spaces that are available to you, up along the Jason Islands and stuff, it would have worked really, really well. And with some of the additional information we had available, which we'll talk about on the 25th, about when the raids were coming and when they were launching, there were a lot of things that could be done to compensate for the basic lack, and were done for the basic lack of AEW, airborne early warning, that was available to the battle group through no fault of anybody who was present in the South Atlantic. But I do think that there's a certain mindset that comes along with somebody who's been primarily a submariner his entire career and has a basic understanding, but not a nuanced understanding of the air group or the of how to fully use the air power. And yes, I know Woodward. I think he commanded a Type 42 at one point. But
yeah, he was in charge of Sheffield.
Well, there you have it. And look, I'm not impugning the man. And there, but for the grace of God, go all of us. These are tough decisions. But the consensus in some of the books I've read seems to be that he wasn't super open to suggestion from his air staff, and some of his warriors. And I get it. The buck stops with him. He had to make the decisions, but he was taking other chances, and this is wartime. And as he said, you lose destroyers in wartime. And I'm not trying to be flippant at all about what you went through, but he may have actually been able to protect, or letting the captain fight his ship just seems pretty basic to me, which is probably why I never went above 04. But so that being said, that's just my interjection. There seems to be a disconnect with air ops being fully understood by Woodward, and he had a lot going on. I get that.
And Keith, how much did Captain Hartdyke talk to you as a ship's company about the sort of what we're being told to do against what I would like to do? Was there any sort of discussion about that going on around the ship?
There was at least one daily briefing from either the captain or the XO to keep everyone informed, because obviously in the ops room you knew what was happening roughly, but in the middle of an air raid, no one's going to come up on the main broadcast and say, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
So everyone was kept informed of what was happening, threats inbound, outbound, what's happening close by, and other pertinent news, like the landings took place at dark 30 tonight, this morning.
Yeah. Can I defend Woodward a bit? I'll do devil's advocate. So, Coventry is thinking, right, I need room to seaward to employ 965 radar, 992 and CDAR. Okay. And we know that Argentine raids were coming in at medium high altitude. Coventry knows that moving target indication is poor, but performance gets better out to seaward. And I think Hartdyke is very much aware that the ship isn't up to speed with alarm procedure snap shoots. So those 10-mile engagements, 15, 20 miles coming off land. So Woodward, however, I think if you look at the signals in the BOI, I think it does him a disservice to say he kind of laid the law down and said, this is what you're going to do. I mean, Broadsword and Coventry, right? They had a conversation. There was a CO's consultation, and they signaled to CTG, and they said, look, we want to do a more aggressive patrol line. We get what your requirements are. The amphibious assault area is absolutely key and is getting spanked. And we understand that if we can interdict inbound raids or even mug outgoing aircraft, right, makes perfect sense. And CTG kind of, if you look at the signals, Woodward was like, yeah, okay. But you need to appreciate that if you're going to do that, I still need my RAP, my recognized air picture, right? I've got some requirements. I need you to be able to talk to the amphibious operating area on LORC, UHF. I need you to be able to control CAP. I need the CAP to be overhead to give them good endurance so that they can protect you. But I want you to start knocking back these air raids. And I think my gut feeling is, and reading the signals, Broadsword and Coventry were given quite a lot of latitude to do this. I think Flag was always kept informed by signal. And I think definitely Flag always endorsed what the Surface Action Group were going to do. I think it's very easy to kind of criticize Woodward, but looking at the signals and looking at the to and fro, there seemed to be a reasonable exchange of views between Flag and the SAG. And certainly reading Hartdyke's book, he gives the impression that he felt that Woodward was definitely astride the game and was kind of willing to listen. And there was a good two-way exchange of information. So I think on the 25th of May, I don't think this was a case of the ships were where they shouldn't have been. I think it was a fair compromise. I think the requirements of the amphibious assault area were taken into account. And I think both parties kind of said, well, look, this is the best that we can do. And ultimately, CTG signed it off and went, yeah, go for it.
I think you're right. Obviously, this was a compromise that was driven by the fact that, as we said on a bunch of our Falkland odds, that they didn't have AEW that would have allowed for the comprehensive air picture to exist. And two things that's kind of support what you're saying, for me, also playing devil's advocate, is the fact that a dedicated attack was made on these ships because they were having such an impact on the tactical picture. And the other fact that on the morning of the 25th, there were Argentinian sorties that were running on the southern route, that runs to the south of Cape Meredith. Yeah, Cape Meredith. So there were implications that the Argentinians had become aware of this picket and were beginning to respond to it operationally. But frankly, having to go all the way down to Cape Meredith, for those of you not looking at a map, that adds a lot of air miles and a lot of refueling requirements, and it has all sorts of impacts. And clearly the choice to put a picket out there had impacted the Argentinian, whether it was 20 miles to the west of where it was, or in the actual position where they're operating off of Pebble Island. To me, that's clear.
And I think the AOA was absolutely key. I think at this stage, the Argentines knew that if they could kill the beachhead, game was over. Right? We were ashore. Therefore, everything rested on killing a couple of high-value units in the anchorage. And if doing that meant killing the gatekeepers, and they knew what Type 42s were. They knew the limitations of 965, 992 radar. I think the unknown quality was the Type 22. You know, they even knew our air defense procedures because they'd sent a Type 42 and she'd done a week at FOST, Portland, before she'd gone to Argentina. So they were pretty much abreast of procedures, but I think that Type 22 was an unknown quality for them. And I think that's why they dedicated, Latin, a 4-ship strike for them with their aircraft availability, that was a big gamble for them, wasn't it? After previous failures and the attack on Glasgow, they really rolled the dice on that. And I think that might indicate the degree of importance they attributed to this pair of ships.
Yeah, and they had lost, the 5th Fighter Group had lost 2 pilots to that picket earlier that morning. That was what actually triggered this particular operation that we're going to discuss. That it came from the top. It was from Comodoro Rivadavia, from the Southern Air Force. Go get those pickets. It was, very targeted, and it was a real problem for them. And aircraft were like for example, availability of aircraft, like they couldn't afford to lose too many. The fleet was reduced, and of the 2 flights that left in the early afternoon, the one that we're going to discuss, to go after these 2 ships, 2 had to turn back due to technical faults. So it ended up being two aircraft flights, as we'll see when we discuss it in a few minutes.
I'm devil's advocate for Sandy Woodward, but I kind of, if you look at it from an air defense point of view, and you've done it, comms were everything then. I don't think they had a Link 10 picture to the AOA, so everything rested on Lork. That's a busy kind of picture, isn't it, Keith? You'll have done Air Picture Reporter Local, but given on the day of the race, and Air Picture Reporter Local was a phenomenally important job then, because you would be reporting on Lork, and you're giving virtually a voice talk down of raids coming in, and from that, fighter controllers are going to task off Harriers to go and do intercept. So, it was a really responsible job, and I see why Sandy Woodward would one of his big considerations was, can Coventry and Broadsword talk to San Carlos on Lork, which was encrypted, and the Argentines, I didn't realize this, they were getting very good at signals interception and jamming, and there was a real fear that if you went from Lork UHF to Lork HF, which was unencrypted, they might be able to jump in on that and start messing around with group air defense. So, yeah, I personally, I think it was the right call, and I think looking at the signals, I think actually Sandy Woodward gave Coventry Broadsword latitude to decide what they were going to do. And I think anyone who says, well, they were there and they were attacked simply because CTG wanted them as a decoy, I don't go along with that at all. I don't think that ties in with Sandy Woodward's sort of persona, and I think he was just being practical and kind of trading off that range, CDART range, 965 radar range, comprehensive air picture, talking to the AOA, controlling the cap, the maximum range that the Harriers could fly to cover this, this 2-ship surface action group, and he made a call. And I don't think it was a bad one.
I'll back you up on that, Dom, because my critical analysis goes like this. 21st of May, there's no Type 64. Ardent's lost, and several other ships are damaged. 22nd of May, there is a Type 64. They're operating a north-south patrol northwest of Carcass Island, which is off the northwest tip of West Falkland. Now, as it happens, the Argentines don't really fly on the 22nd of May, which I think, and Latin can correct me if I'm wrong, was a combination of weather and that they'd taken such losses on the 21st that they were kind of reorganising a bit. On the 23rd, Keith, you got recalled to the task force, the carrier battle group, didn't you? Is that right?
I'll take your word for it. I'll
Yeah.
lectures then.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for whatever reason, on the 23rd, CGG recalls Coventry to the carrier battle group and sends broadsword back into San Carlos. On the 23rd, Antelope is hit and is eventually lost when they're trying to defuse the bombs, and one of them goes off. 24th and 25th, Coventry and Broadsword are off Pebble Island. They're controlling the northern cap station. And again, on the 24th and 25th, there's no ships sunk and no significant damage to any of the ships in San Carlos. So on the days when the Type 64 is there, it does its job, because the losses and bad damage to the ships only occur on the days when the Type 64 isn't there, and it's the last raid of the day in the amphibious operating area, in which Coventry's lost. The attack on Atlantic Conveyor comes afterwards. So the critical analysis, I think, is that it worked. It did. The Type 64 did the job it was sent there to do. Just very sadly, they couldn't quite deal with that last raid of the day. And David Harddyke never criticises the Admiral in his book or any of the TV documentaries that he's appeared in or interviews. And, you know, he says that line, doesn't it? I think it was in Sea of Fire, where he says, war's like a game of chess. You have to give up certain pieces to get checkmate, and I was one of those pieces.
And that's seen throughout, you know, many of the conflicts. Second World War, where the Monty would have sacrificed, you know, many you know, tank units just to achieve his aim.
I think in one part of his book, he said it felt like we were decoys. That was one part I disagreed with, and I think as a CO of a 42, I was surprised that he said that. You know, because this guy was an air defense expert. He knew his stuff back to front about it. So I wouldn't have said that. And there was another bit I disagreed with about his assessment of the loss of Sheffield, but yeah. As in general, I don't think there was over sort of criticism about CTG, about the decisions that were made. I think they've all been post-war, and some of the criticisms that I have read have been from people with no sort of naval experience at all. And of course, we have to remember that Woodward knew that the Argentines had 2 Type 42 destroyers. So, you know, you talk about 3D chess. He had chess pieces that the enemy knew their full capabilities, and maybe he was using those to his advantage. You know, if the enemy knows the capabilities of 965 radar and 992 radar, that's going to affect their decision-making process. So then you put your pieces in place to maximize that, and then you work around their potential countermeasures for that. So really difficult. I don't think, as I said, I don't think any criticism of the placing of Coventry and Broadsword are justified on that day. I think he made a good call it seemed a good compromise between providing the wrap that recognised their picture, getting a cap overhead with decent endurance, and he rolled the dice on it, and it wasn't down to him, Coventry being lost that day.
And when David Hart Dyke says, "Oh, I felt like a decoy," he actually wrote, I don't know how many people know this, he actually wrote 4 weeks in May in 1983. And of course, you would feel like you were a decoy if you've then got sunk. But he only ever, this came out in his Imperial War Museum interviews, he only ever wrote 4 weeks in May for the benefit of his family, so that they could read it one day and appreciate, what the ship had done and everything that had gone on. And then it was only much later, 25 years after the war, that he was persuaded to publish it.
Yeah, and he doesn't really, correct me if I'm wrong here, he doesn't mention about broadsword being put 5 cables ahead, which, was a real surprise. Because Keith, you said, I mean, it's just common sense from a ship handling point of view. Ship ahead guide with the shortest range missile system, she really dictates how you maneuver as a pair. And then Coventry is stern, the 42 is stern. She kind of follows guides. And I don't think he really talked about that, but we'll get that into that on 25th of May.
And another thing that was going on this whole time, sort of a multiplier effect that somebody like Woodward would be considering, is a pretty effective cap system had been set up over central West Falkland by I think it was 801.
That was 801 station. Yeah,
they were running the low cap in the valleys and having some effect on the aircraft that were trying to come down King George Bay and maybe Byron Sound, but more King George Bay, which forced, in my opinion, the Argentinians to go north or south and to come down Falkland Sound or all the way around and come in from East Fog, the Chozel Sound and those kind of areas. And so, that's going on too, along with everything that you and Dom have said. They're understanding, the Argentinians understanding the capabilities of a Type 42, and just they had a very good understanding of it. This wasn't intel based. This is actual knowledge. And the conundrum that Woodward was in, of having to, trying to mitigate the risk that whoever he was going to put out there was going to experience, and being very short on Type 42s at this point, and having to focus on the troops on the beachhead. So that occurred to me while you guys were talking, that the way that 801 had effectively cut off the middle of West Falkland was also probably in the equation for the Argentinians.
I didn't, for Sharkey Ward's book, I can't recall what he said about 25th of May, but Keith, you've met him, haven't you?
Yeah, I did the Falklands 40 reunion in Orlando 3 years ago. Very nice gentleman. Unfortunately, he died just a couple of years ago. He didn't talk much. I don't think he talked about the 25th of May at all, apart from the fact that 2 of the Shark cap to the north of us were hauled off because Captain Hart Dyke said, "We'll take them out with Dart." And then there was the guesswork. If we hadn't gone with birds, could the cap have taken them out? That's a question that no one could answer.
I have the quote in front of me. Commodore Clapp had noted that most of the attackers that penetrated the cap barrier were doing so to the north of the Sound on a route that took them close to Pebble Island. This northerly cap station was usually filled by 800 Squadron Shars from the Hermes. flying at medium or high level. So in order to reinforce this cap station's reduced effectiveness, he picketed the noted avenue of arrival with 2 ships, Type 42 Coventry armed with Sea Dart and Type 22 Broadsword armed with Seawolf. The combination of the 2 types, known compositely as a Type 64, should have been a lethal deterrent to the attackers, but instead, the Argentinians took it as an invitation they couldn't refuse. On the morning of the 25th, a Learjet reconnaissance aircraft overflew the amphibious operating area very early in the day at a very high level, and its photographs revealed the position of the 2 warships. During the first part of that day, which was an Argentinian national holiday and also the day of their soccer team was contesting the World Cup, attacks against San Carlos were less than had been the norm. Had the enemy taken enough losses? With all the claims of kills from within San Carlos water, it would not have been surprising. Those claims didn't actually match up to post-war examination. Very few aircraft were shot down in San Carlos. The lull in the action was more as a result of all the Argentinian pilots wanting to watch their football team on television than it was back to business as usual. The business began with 4 Skyhawks approaching the 2 ships lying off Pebble Island at low level and high speed from over the land. They were armed with 1,000-pound bombs. There was little time to react to their covert approach and attack, but the cap section of Neil Thomas that was on hand was vectored in to intercept the A4s. Sea Harriers had contact and were almost at Sidewinder release range in the attackers 6 o'clock when they were called off by their controller. Coventry and Broadsword had acquired their targets, and the Sea Harriers were forbidden to follow their prey into the ship's missile engagement zone. Tragedy then struck. And we'll talk about the rest later. So there's a couple of things in there that I think might be not completely factual or questionable, but that sort of gives the mindset that was pervasive, at least in Sharkey Ward's mind, and therefore probably the majority of 801 Squadron.
Guys, nothing but respect for this man. He was an incredible pilot and commander. I got to throw some doubt into this claim of watching the soccer.
Absolutely. And I'm pretty sure the Learjet did not fly over the AOA. I mean, I might be wrong about that. And there were Lears out that day for sure. But that makes no sense when you talk about especially the early engagement, which was 9:30 local, time. So that probably would have been a sunrise launch from I think it was as San Julian or Rio Gallegos. I can't remember which that one came out of.
Yeah, I mean, a big fan of Sharkey Ward, but yeah, I think if you read his book and you've got a background in air defense, I would say he's 90% bang on, 5% dubious, and 5% I think he got the stuff absolutely wrong. But I think his book stands the test of time because what he gets right is absolutely pertinent even today. But yeah, a couple of things.
I agree. I mean, 90% is a pretty good grade. So, but yeah, there's stuff in there that, as time has passed, I mean, he probably wrote that book again 20, 25 years ago. So, the things have come to light, as is always the case. But yeah, it's a good, for anybody who's interested in reading more about the air war. His is a very good, and it's a rip and read, and it really moves along nicely. And he's quite the character. So I recommend the book as both informative and entertaining.
This is a guy who there used to be a show called Pebble Mill at one. It was like your lunchtime viewing for stay-at-home mums and unoccupied housewives. And it was fun. I think it was in Birmingham or
yes, it was.
Like that.
It was.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? And Sharkey Ward, who was known as Mr. Harrier, they decided to land a Harrier outside of a studio. And what they don't show in the footage, so they laid a special kind of matting out. So Sharkey Ward put a Harrier down outside the studio, caused an absolute catastrophic meltdown of every woman within sort of 100 miles when he walked into the studio with his beard, with his helmet. But he also managed to blow a load of stuff from the jet over a car park. So, I mean, this guy was, you know, if there was Harrier Doctrine all the way through till 2007, Sharky Ward had his name on it. But
His
yeah, I
thumbprint
think,
was on it. Yeah.
yeah, I think there were a couple of things. But hey, look, I disagree with, we've absolutely disagreed with the BOI on Sheffield. I think the BOI on Ardent was absolutely disgusting to many degrees, and that was the Admiralty review of ships companies' actions, and we took that apart, and we said it was at best disingenuous and at worst absolutely insulting to the ship's company. And I don't think command on HMS Antelope were held to account, as I don't think they were on the Sheffield either. They were catastrophic failings.
That wraps up part 2 of our series. Next week, we'll conclude with an in-depth analysis of the 25th of May. If you want to hear more about that day from someone who was actually there, be sure to check out Dougie's story, available now on our Patreon.